Good morning and welcome to this webinar where we will discuss the latest book titled The Lost Imperialist, written by Professor Bruce Gilley, Professor of Political Science at the Portland State University and a member of the board of the National Association of Scholars. This book charts the life of Sir Alan Burns alongside the collapse of British Empire in Africa. The book is a straightforward narrative. It's a defense of a worldview that isn't very common or can be found these days in academic circles. Therefore, it's really refreshing. And I met Dr. Gilley at a colloquium in Oxford a few years back, around the same time when his excellent paper on the cost-benefit analysis of colonialism was redacted. And there was this huge, constant thing within the academy. But I'm really glad that this book came out with Regular Publishing. An introduction: I am Dr. Sumantra Mitra. I am a National Security Fellow at CFTNI and an elected historian, early career historian at the Royal Historical Society. And I have the pleasure to talk to Dr. Gilley about this book today and introduce and discuss about it. Now, a couple of ground rules before we start this webinar. I was told that it's going to be very much focused on the time, which is always something which I appreciate. So we talk for a bit about the book and a few questions that I'm going to ask before moving on to some more important parts, that is the question answers from you. Now, there is a box, as you all can see, where there is a question answer button where you can also raise hands, but I would appreciate if you type in the questions which I can read. As the Bard once reminded, brevity and propriety, as I always add, is the soul of wit. So please keep the questions short and to the point. With that in mind, I am going to stop talking and I'm going to start with this webinar. Hello, Dr. Gilley. It's nice to talk to you. So before we kind of delve into the more important questions, I want to ask, I want you to explain why Sir Alan Burns. Please tell us what made you choose this subject. Tell us a bit about him, your book, what got you into this.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Mitra, and thanks for hosting this. You neglected to say that when we met at first at Oxford, it was a secret colloquium. It was being held in the dungeons of Christ Church College, where nobody was aware we were there, and there was a great wooden door blocking the way for any assailants. It was a medieval experience, to be sure, and and that was because Dr. Bigger dared not announce that we were having a colloquium on the paper and on the more general issues of history and even contemporary politics. So that's the background to our meeting, and I think it's quite apt because that's the background to this book in many ways. I got interested in Burns really because I was reading about Chinua Achebe, who's the great Nigerian novelist, and Achebe, as you may know, his last book before he died was a kind of, I don't want to say a mea culpa for his reputation as anti-colonial, but somewhat of a revision of his own reputation, in which he said, the Biafra War, which was the subject of that book, was in some extent a result of our rapid decolonization, of our hasty decolonization, and the British ran this country better than we do. So this was got me into that topic, and through that I found Burns. And I think what was interesting to me about Burns is most people will say, I've never heard of this guy. Who's this guy? And that's true. And that to some extent is astounding because most imperial historians consider him to be sort of one of the great late colonial officials on the level of Lord Lugard, who we all know. So my question is, why is this person so unknown, given that he was the governor of the Gold Coast, the most important African colony during World War II, to be sure. He was in the colonial office. He helped Churchill form the Anglo-American Alliance. He was the official spokesman on colonial affairs for the UK at the United Nations for 10 years at the critical time, 1948 to to 57, more or less, when there was an opportunity to stop rapid decolonization, and Burns was at the center of that fight, and he lost that fight, of course. And yet he was, and then the second part of Burns was not just he had a astounding professional career, but he wrote vigorously in defense of colonialism. The best known book would be his. This is the one that really kind of caught my eye. Sir Alan Burns' In Defense of Colonies, which was, in a sense, his summary after his time in the United Nations. And I was looking at the date, and this was not 1857, this was 1957. Someone is writing a book in defense of colonies in 1957. Who is this guy? Why do we not know about him? As I got into reading his writings, I became just intrigued by his life, by his personal story. Born in the Caribbean, fought his way up the ranks, didn't have a college education. Basically, his family was poor. Almost lost his life in a riot in St. Kitts in 1897, and was not just a hardworking, humble person, but was well loved everywhere he went. I mean, just seemed to elicit a fanatical loyalty among colonized peoples everywhere he went, and lived a great life, wrote about it, defended the colonial enterprise, and in many ways was vindicated. He died in 1980, and his last 10 years, the 1970s, as we know, the 1970s is the great lost decade in the third world. I mean, horrific things are happening. Nobody's paying attention. The Western media and academics have lost interest because there's no white men around to blame. So it's just a big kind of amnesia about this period. And Burns is vindicated, I mean, tragically vindicated, dies in 1980. So to me, that life encapsulates so many big issues about history and contemporary academia. And that's why I wanted to write about him.
I want to take up one of the things that you mentioned right here. He didn't go to college, you mentioned. So he was not a classic, an imperial, officer class that Britain was known for example. Like, it's not that Eton Oxford kind of guy. He was born in the colonies, and he kind of had this understanding with the local people. It's sort of the same dynamic that we see even these days. Like, there is a middle class patriotism which we cannot find in the upper class elite. I mean, for example, in India, when there was this decolonizing movement going on, a lot of elite British, Cambridge educated people were opposed to colonialism, whereas local officers and they had a really good relation with local people. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sumatra, and it's not one I've thought about, but I think you're right. His family couldn't afford to send him to college. Interestingly, the two members of his family who made it to Cambridge, of course, both became radical leftists opposed to colonialism. Most famously, his brother Emile, who was a leading member of the British Communist Party, was frankly a traitor to the United Kingdom, was aware of and supported traitorous activities by members of the British Communist Party and their spying for and behavior for the Soviet Union, trained black radicals like Kwame Nkrumah in London to go back and destroy colonialism. And yes, he was the Cambridge man. And there's a funny moment where Alan and his brother Emile, when they're young, are sort of competing for the affections of a beautiful woman in St. Kitts, and eventually she sides with Alan, becomes his wife, and Emile writes a letter and says, like, why would you get married to this ill-educated clerk? And I'm a Cambridge man, I have high tea and we go rowing and we have intellectual meetings deep into the night, and in many ways that is precisely the split you're seeing. And of course, those Cambridge types and those classicists become the most virulent anti-colonialists later, and they are detached from reality. Sir Alan, was not of that sort, and I think his practical bent and his experience is what actually makes him a robust and unapologetic defender of colonialism.
Before I get into the book, there's one more question which was bothering me when I was reading this book. a lot of people know about, the Soviet support for communist regimes and, throughout the third world countries, especially in Africa in the 70s, as you mentioned, like majority were funded by the Soviet Union. But you raised an important point about a lot of African nationalists and communists being influenced by socialist movements in the United States, or even the support for republicanism from the United States. Like you mentioned Kennedy, you see this connection between the American left, Black nationalists and African nationalists and communist movements. So can you tell us a bit about that? Like how much were they affected? Like, what were influencing these movements? Were they was that like an alignment of sorts, or is there was just genuine ideological push behind it? What was behind Kennedy's support, for example?
Right. Yeah. So the big challenge after World War II, which confronts Sir Alan at the United Nations, is it's not just that you have the Soviet Union, claiming to be the sort of defender of Black and brown people everywhere, and also, frankly, the Nazis and the ex-Nazis, who also had been defenders of the oppressed everywhere. I mean, half of the Congress Party was, smitten with Adolf Hitler. Gandhi himself was, quite friendly with Hitler and wrote him nice letters about, how oppressed he is. And so you had not only the totalitarian movements of Europe, who were, claiming to be defenders of the oppressed and fighting anti-imperial battles. So that's what the Nazis and the communists. The Nazis were defeated. Of course, a couple of thousand Nazis went to Cairo and worked for Nasser's Egypt in continuing anti-colonial agitation there. The communists, meanwhile, became major threats. But what was happening on the other side was the Americans were, for both ideological and practical reasons, also consorting with and supporting anti-colonial movements. Now, part of that was a realist practicality that, look, the Soviets are there, and we need to have something to offer that doesn't sound like we're, conspiring with imperial rule. So that was a practical side to that. And but there was also frankly, a kind of anti-colonial romanticism on the American side, and it's encapsulated almost entirely on the Democratic Party. Yes, Kennedy is really just naive. He encourages Nkrumah to make revolution in Ghana and says, well, we had a revolution and look how well it turned out for us. And then there's also the real figure that I focus in on is Mason Sears, who was the US representative on the trusteeship council at the UN. He's a classic New England patrician patriarch, and full of revolutionary vigor, and loves to hang out with Black people and take pictures with them and see himself as so progressive. And he's an imminent threat to the British Empire, and Burns clashes with him a lot. The people of reason were in the State Department, of course, who were saying, hey, let's not forget, we didn't rebel against the British colonial inheritance. We just inherited it and we carried it on. And the reason we succeeded is because we didn't trash it, because we maintained so much of our British colonial inheritance. And that's what we need to learn. But that's the challenge. And it is a challenging story to tell, because in the United States, of course, I do feel like there's still a lack of coming to terms with what the American Revolution was, and more importantly, what the American Revolution was not. And it was not an anti-colonial revolution of the sort that we saw in the Third World after World War II.
Right, which is a great segue to my next question from your book. You obviously studied the primary documents, and there's a quote from your book which I want to read, where Dankwa is in the jail, and he's saying about the British. They treated us as gentlemen, not as galley slaves, and provided each of us with bungalows, with a garden, together with opportunity for reading and writing. In fact, I took my typewriter and papers for the purpose. Colonial judge released them both against the wishes of colonial administration. The reason why detention is free and civilized and humane in Ghana is so much worse than the British colonialism. Do you feel that there was this sense of regret when you were reading the primary documents, like when you were going, because these are not the kind of things that you would read in modern post-colonial research about the British Empire, and these are important, facts of life. I mean, you can actually see these people talking about how their life was under the British Empire, and it's completely like neglected in current times. So it was it like a genuine regret, or was it like a oh no, this is not real liberalism, real liberalism has never been tried, that kind of stuff.
Well, I think, and there's echoes there of Gandhi's detention too. Like, oh, he was so oppressed, right? He had a bungalow and a typewriter, and wrote most of his main books while he was suffering under British oppression, and of course, so I think there's a childish naivety which gets a big dose of reality after decolonization, where they realize that, oh, a legal system that requires justification for detention, and releases someone if that justification is not forthcoming, that just doesn't happen. That's just not something that's kind of naturally existing in the soil, right? That requires a certain system, and it's quick to disappear when those institutions disappear. And so Dankwa, of course, who was Kwame Nkrumah's nemesis in Ghana and eventually dies in detention under Kwame Nkrumah. By the way, the faculty lounge is still pumping out like odes to Kwame Nkrumah as if, he was some great progressive liberator. He was an evil tyrant.
He was called a nationalist of Africa by BBC. I think I'm forgetting the exact quote, but he was given like the Pan-African nationalist of the decade or something, just very recently, like last decade.
Right, just recently, right? So yes, and Adolf Hitler was the sort of great progressive liberator of Europe too. I mean, what if they said that? I mean, this is what they are saying, right? I mean, these are the people that are still kind of have that reputation. So I do think there is a hidden secret about colonialism, and this is the nub of it, which is basically the colonized liked it, and it was legitimate. Now, this is the thing that has made my critics absolutely apoplectic. It's what caused my faculty union to issue a fatwa against my research, saying that my research is oppressive to brown and black people. Of course, I keep having brown and black people on my podcast, Empire of the Mind, who are saying, no, this is the experience we had. And it's the real threat to the whole post-colonial agenda, right? Because if you can show that the entire post-colonial agenda is founded on a lie about the legitimacy of colonialism, then it collapses into nothing but sort of narcissistic academic gamesmanship in the academy, which is what most post-colonial scholarship is.
You also mentioned this village tribal chieftains who joined the British Empire for wars. Like, modern post-colonial research would always say, like, they were all coerced, to go to war for the British. But you take this quote, like, we felt we were British and we were safe under the British administration. Explained the son of a minor chief who was the first to volunteer. If they had trouble elsewhere, we went. What was the motivation for these people to join? They see themselves as like subjects, or they see like a broader cause for them to join?
Well, I think it raises a question about when we explain motivation, what's happening there, and so Martin Klein, for example, who is this former University of Toronto professor, who's one of the many academics who took to his computer to denounce the case for colonialism. And in his case, to be fair, wrote a thorough and scholarly, critique of my article, which is great. I mean, that's what academics are supposed to do, not have, fainting spells and issue fatwas. But, he wrote a critique. Now, I responded to his critique in my response to all the critics of the paper. And he said, well, Gilly says, that colonialism was legitimate, but, I know from my research that, that the Africans had no affection for their rulers, right? My response was, well, affection and legitimacy are not the same thing. So, what legitimacy refers to is not that you love your rulers, or that you think that they're wonderful, or you want to die and go to heaven and meet them in heaven. No, it means that compared to feasible alternatives, and in light of the constraints of the situation, you feel that ruler or that institution has a rightful place in exercising that authority. That's all it is. It's a practical moral calculation about alternatives and about the rightfulness, meaning the justification for the use of authority. It hasn't to do with love or affection or deep contentment. I mean, that none of that stuff belongs in political science or the study of political attitudes. I mean, love your gods, love your family, love your children, but we're in the realm of politics here, and we're in the realm of hard, concrete choices that people face in light of alternatives, which in most of these colonized areas, as well as in India, of course, is almost certainly another alien ruler who is going to be much less liberal, much less developmental, and much less likely to set you on the road to independence. So that's what I mean by legitimacy. So when those village chiefs, they were referring to recruiting drives that were taking place in World War II, where the British were recruiting soldiers from places like the Gold Coast, and they would send recruiting parties to villages and say, we need to recruit X number of people. And when that village chief's son said, when they came, we went, it didn't mean that he loved the British, or he loved the idea of putting on a British uniform and saluting the Union Jack. No, it meant that he was a good ruler in the sense of understanding the practical choices faced by his people, and understanding that British rule and maintaining British rule was the most legitimate alternative. Now that's an important distinction, but it's one that the critics kind of forget, that they think that when I use the term legitimacy, I'm referring to some deep love affair going on. No, this is politics, right? And practical. On the other hand, I would emphasize that this is not just kind of self-interested calculation, right? Which I think is also a mistake. I mean, I think there isn't, whenever you make a choice about legitimate rulers, it has an ethical dimension to it. And the reason we know that is because the British, and like most of the European empires, had hardly any coercive force on the ground. If this was just a calculation of like, if we rebel, we're going to get crushed. No, there wouldn't have been a British Empire, because the coercive force was so minimal that a purely self-interest calculation about the cost of rebellion would have led the British Empire to collapse everywhere. It existed because it was seen as morally legitimate.
So I will play a little bit of devil's advocate, because that's part of my job. Keeping my own, personal political ideology aside, you do mention a very important fact, that the British didn't have the coercive power. Like they like in political science language, they didn't have the aggregate power to use for predominant force in any part of the world, but they managed with this kind of legitimacy. Like I remember I was doing a little bit of research a couple of days back, and there were like 160,000 troops all together during the Second World War in India, which already had a population of 30 million. It's frankly not possible to rule over a country that massive with that much amount of force unless a significant amount of that country wants you to be there. It's a question which is forgotten. But how do you tackle the charge that this was achieved with a very clever balance of power politics, like between different tribes, between different ethnicities, So what do you say to that charge, for example? But that's a huge post-colonial argument. Like, it was just cynical balance of power. You support these guys and you support that guys, and you don't want them to unify in a way. So what do you say to that?
Well, yeah, it's kind of like saying, well, the only reason you're able to rule is because, we have such a plural society. And so, yes, that's true. So what's the alternative to eliminate the pluralism of that society? I mean, it's a non sequitur, because yes, legitimacy arises in the context of a specific social situation, a sociology of political sociology of a country. And if the political sociology is one of extensive ethnic and tribal pluralism, then yes, legitimacy or the ability to rule comes easier when your main sort of achievement in colonial rule is to prevent interethnic or intertribal war. And if that's seen as just a kind of prudential argument, but sometimes prudential arguments are moral arguments, right? I mean, the reason we have coercive forces is because we think they're morally justified, right? And so divide and rule, yeah, you're right. There's a classic kind of divide and rule argument. Oh, this is just kind of cynical manipulation of the colonized. Well, it's kind of demeaning, right? It just assumes that these brown and black people are so easy to manipulate, and these white people must be so hyper intelligent. They could just step into these complex situations that no one else could rule and magically just move pieces around like a chessboard. It's demeaning, right? Because it totally robs moral agency from the colonized, and that somehow they were just being pushed around by Colonel Blimp while he's sitting at his club playing a game of whist in London. Ridiculously demeaning and demoralizing robs agency. It's also, it's social scientifically inaccurate, right? Because it assumes that the use of power and the deployment of power in order to maintain the peace is somehow unethical. Well, actually, that's the most ethical thing that states do, is that they create kind of pacts and peace through the maintenance of power in a way that's dispersed enough and accountable enough that doesn't lead to the outbreak of civil war. And if you want to see the evidence of that, just look at any colony after independence, right? India included, right? Which, I mean, the great sort of argument about partition was, well, this kind of divide and rule, coming home to roost. Well, was it? I mean, it didn't happen during the era. It happened at the time of independence. I know there's a debate on partition, but let's be clear that a society that is not divided is not able to be ruled through divide and rule. So, the British system offered a peace. Now, was it a temporary peace or an enduring peace? I don't know. I think you can look at countries like Kenya and say British rule was very effective in creating a unified people there that would not have existed absent that colonial inheritance.
So I'm going to go to the question answer, but I just have one question before I move to that segment, because this is a study of the subtext of what you wrote in that book. First of all, I mean, I'd like you to say what you thought about the end days of Alan Burns, like what he was thinking was the reason why the British Empire was collapsing. But before that, there is a bit of a contemporary relevance of, states which are failing in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Central America, for example, where there's massive amount of migration happening. One can argue that there is a case for colonialism where you don't have to send in the huge military, but it doesn't, harm, where you can just go and send your troops, or you can go and send people who can actually have an established order, because essentially, as the old saying goes, anarchy is far worse than tyranny, right? I mean, so we are seeing all this massive movement of people. Fundamental reason is because there is no state authority, and there is no one, local legitimate government to do that. So do you think any contemporary relevance to the study of late imperial officers, for example?
Well, yeah. Well, I think Burns is interesting because, of course, he's born in St. Kitts and Nevis. He begins his colonial career there. He goes to Nigeria. He gets sent back to the Bahamas, where he becomes colonial secretary and is the de facto governor there, because the governors basically just enjoyed golf and swimming. So he was the one who really ran the Bahamas when he was there in the 20s. Sent back to Nigeria, then comes back and is the governor of British Honduras, which is now Belize, right? And so one of the things I always say is, who's crossing the United States southern border now? Where are these migrants coming from? Are they coming from Belize? No, there's no one from Belize trying to get into the United States. Are they coming from the Bahamas? No. Are they coming from St. Kitts and Nevis? No. Are they coming from Bermuda? No. Jamaica? No. Trinidad and Tobago? No. I mean, where are the migrants coming from? Are they coming from the former colonies because the British Empire ruined these places and caused so much trauma? No, of course not. They're precisely not coming from these places. They're coming from the rapidly decolonized places. They're coming from Haiti. They're coming from South American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador. So it is the sort of the dog that didn't bark, right? It's not so much who is coming, but who's not coming, right? Who's not on our southern border. And one of my favorite photos, actually, in the book, from his late years, when he is sort of on call and he's being called in to solve problems in places like Fiji, where he is sent to sort of solve a looming ethnic conflict. But is when he goes back to British Honduras in 1963. So you can see that photo, but sorry, there he is. So he's basically being met at the airport by officials in British Honduras there. It's 1963. It was a courtesy visit, but what I love about that photo is, first of all, nobody's writing stories about British Honduras in 1963. Why? it's an incredibly successful transition to self-rule, right? It's a non-story. It's a non-story because it's a British success story and nobody has to write about it. Secondly is, Burns is involved in and thinking about what's happening in the colonies right to the end. I mean, he is, and I call this, he's a colonialist in the sense of he takes an active interest in what's happening in these places after the white man leaves, right? And that was precisely the colonial interest because, the New York Times stopped writing about the colonial areas, once the colonists left. The United Nations, which had commissions of inquiry about human rights abuses in the colonial era, as soon as these places become independent, not interested, right? So that's one of the things I point about Dankwa in the Gold Coast is, when he gets detained by Kwame Nkrumah, he does what he did in the British colonial era, which is he smuggles out letters from detention and sends them to the United Nations, expecting there'll be a storm. Well, for some reason, the people at the United Nations are not interested in black on black oppression. They were very interested in colonial oppression, but as soon as Ghana becomes independent, Dankwa sends the letters out, and they're like, whatever, just kind of independence and the price of progress and whatnot. So Burns will have none of it, right? And he takes an active interest in what's happening in these places, whether it's Nigeria, Ghana, British Honduras, Fiji, partition in India and the aftermath. I mean, he is a colonialist to the end in the good sense of he cares about human lives. He cares about human flourishing. He cares about what happens to the peoples and the nations after the colonial system ends, unlike the anti-colonialists who completely lost interest in these peoples once their kind of ideological agenda had disappeared from the map.
So we have a question from Dr. Robert Lyman, which we kind of like touched onto it, but this is a better frame question, so I'm going to ask you anyway. It's better than what I asked. So how do you counter the common charge that Burns was simply a stooge, along with many others in the British Empire, of a systemically oppressive form of government that fundamentally denied agency to indigenous people across the empire? Like, how do you counter that charge?
It's not true. It's false. Agency was much enhanced by colonial rule, in particular agency for women. So people, I always think about race, class, and gender. If you look at race, class, and gender, it'll really show how bad colonialism was. No, if you look at race, class, and gender, you'll realize that colonialism's main argument, yes, it held countries together, and those in power generally, if they were going to accept, those who rejected the colonial system fought against it and were defeated. Those who accepted it became nabobs and were given all sorts of titles and Sir this and Lady that, and yes, so it went well for the elites if the elites bought into the colonial system. But the real argument for colonialism was race, class, and gender. Minority ethnicities or races who were subject to extermination by domestic rivals. So, the Buganda were about to systematically exterminate the remaining dozen tribes in East Africa had not the British stepped in and created a protectorate. They'd already exterminated 12. There was 12 more they were about to exterminate. The Fulani slave empire of northern Nigeria was about to conquer most of West Africa and turn the entire place into a slave state. I mean, you can go on and on. So from a race standpoint, the British created a safe space for minorities. And India is, legion in that respect as well. Class, the poor people are the ones who liked colonialism the most, and that's the dirty secret. And this, in particular, the case in India. And I just love writing about the kind of enduring upper caste Hindu disdain of colonialism, which to me is really just indicative that upper caste Hindus, who now
not
basically
all upper caste Hindus. I just want to
okay, not all, but who are these post-colonialists in Western universities from India who are denouncing colonialism, right? They're all upper caste Hindus, right? And their amour propre, their sense of dignity, was destroyed by British colonialism because the India poor, the lower castes, preferred the East India Company, and the Hindu upper caste has never forgiven the India's poor for liking British colonial rule better. Go all around the colonies, good for poor people. And gender, good for women, right? So one of the things that I noticed in Sir Alan's work is how often his allies, his local allies, are women, right? So there's this woman called Nurse Say, she was called in British Honduras. She's basically a nurse, head of the local Black Nurses Association in British Honduras. But she's kind of like a kind of social mother, den mother for the colony as a whole. And she's a very powerful, strong woman. She works on social improvement, on economic development. She helps Burns write almost all of the grants that he applies for that basically bring British Honduras into the modern world while he's there, right? Her role is very central to the development of British Honduras, and she was, part of an opportunity structure that existed because of colonial rule. In Ghana, of course, his biggest ally is Lady Quist. She is the wife of the first speaker of the legislature in the Gold Coast, Black African speaker, because Burns is promoting self-government and democratization. And she's the one that basically, when he's getting into trouble in the British press for the ritual murder that occurs while he's governor in 1946-47, she's the one who stands up and defends him, right? So everywhere he goes, the women really come out in his favor. And then there's a third one I would mention. In Nigeria, there's this thing called the Women's War. And the Women's War was basically a tax revolt that took place in Nigeria in, I want to say the early 30s, right? And it's just as Burns returns to Nigeria and from the Bahamas, and the Women's War attracts inordinate attention from the academics because it seems to be this perfect confection of feminism and socialism and anti-colonialism, right? Basically what happened is female traders who mainly sell palm oil and palm products were facing higher taxes from the British authorities. And they riot and they besiege the police station. And after several warnings, the police open fire, and I think a dozen women are killed, and then several more are detained, right? So you can imagine all the operatic books that are written on this by academics. This is feminist, socialist, anti-colonial revolution. It's called the Women's War, right? Okay, so it's nothing of the sort, right? First of all, most of the women who were protesting were press ganged into joining, right? So, and most women didn't join at all anyways. Second of all, what the British were trying to do was modernize the trading economy there with warehouses, with standards. One of the problems is the women all doctored their oil and sold, fake goods, and the British were trying to standardize it. And anti-colonial, no, because a year after it, the place is the most peaceful, loyal part of Nigeria. Why? Because basically the natives saw that the British were right to put down that revolt. And so I love going through the race, class, and gender stuff, not because I'm particularly interested in race, class, and gender, but because this is supposedly the place where you'll really find the underbelly of colonialism. To me, it's where you find the most ringing endorsement of colonialism. And, Burns's life tells that story.
That's a very important point. And I wanted to ask this question before, but now that you've moved in this direction, imperialism was a liberalizing force. And there was a huge section of 19th century liberals, for example, who were very much pro-empire. They thought that it was like a progressive force, capitalism and trade and women's rights and all these things. I mean, Ramon that read at Lord Amherst in 1823, where he said that, you should stop with all the Hindu colleges, but start with more science colleges in Calcutta. So it was very progressive and forward-moving force. So two questions. One, how does that lead to this this idea that we have to be in places where we don't want to be, for example, in Afghanistan, because there is, this women's rights question in issue? Like, what is the balance between, say, national interest and having a progressive, movement in other countries? And the second question is, what changed? Like, what changed in liberals that they kind of turned from this pro-imperial, pro-progressive, internationalist force to what we see now, a self-loathing bunch of people?
Yeah, so I think nothing has changed. I think there have always been arguments for now let's not call it colonialism, let's use a more general term like internationalism, on the left, and there's always been an isolationism on the left, and there's always been an internationalism on the right, and there's always been an isolationism on the right, right? So you are absolutely right that if you go back to, of course, who's the biggest proponent of colonialism? Marx. Marx and Engels both had a very clear idea that feudal societies living without market-based relations under feudal social structures needed to be transformed into, from embedded relationships, face-to-face relationships based on social reciprocity, into disembedded relationships based on participation in the labor market and in production, right? And both of them saw capitalism and capitalism as brought by colonialism as a very progressive force, right? And that was the dominant view on the European and Western left, well into the 1910s, 1920s, right? It's only around 1904 Hobson writes his book, and Lenin then cribs Hobson, and and you see the transformation of the left from a pro-colonial to an anti-colonial position. And that's interesting. What people forget is the same thing is happening on the right, right? Now, this is interesting because someone like Burns is a classic conservative internationalist, right? So he is absolutely conservative, but absolutely someone who believes that, without necessarily taking a single template and imposing it everywhere, but there is a duty to share best practices and good government with others where possible and in a way that's consistent with what's feasible in those places. So there's a liberal international, but there's also a growing isolationism on the right. And Burns runs into that back in the UK, right? One of the reasons why he's so kind of amazed when he returns home is he's found not just that the Labour Party has become more or less anti-imperial, having been more or less pro-imperial, in his early days, but the Conservatives have also become anti-imperial, right? For different reasons, right? Anti-imperial because not that they think that the West is evil, which is what the anti-imperial left believes, but they believe the West is just another culturally unique place. And what are we doing messing about with these brown and black people? They can't be democratic. They're tribal. They can't have a market economy. They all basically based on embedded relationships. So isolationism is just as much a product of the right as it is of the left. And Burns is one of that last generation of what we would call liberal imperialists, which today I think a better term would be conservative imperialists, who still believed in a duty of care and a practical policy of international engagement. And I get critics, interestingly, in the United States. I often on radio shows, the critics who call in are conservatives who say, what you're promoting all this globalism, globalism and internationalism, and we don't believe in globalism and internationalism. That comes from pencil heads at the United Nations and whatnot. And so it's a reminder that yes, you may think from the academy that anti-colonialism is largely confined to the left, but it's not, right? There's a degree of isolationism on the right as well. In particular, when we talk about the contemporary relevance of colonialism, you talk about Afghanistan and Iraq. Yes, this is where we see this coming back. Is like we have no responsibility and no business to be engaged in these distant places with these foreign cultures, trying to stand up a system that is completely alien to them and will never be sustained. We need to stop kidding around and pull up the drawbridge and tend to our own garden. This is a right and left thing, and it's interesting to go back in history and realize how those two left and right colonialism transformed into left and right anti-colonialism.
We have a question from Miguel Del Val about something which you mentioned before, about when we were talking about Kennedy and Africa. Like, what was the role of the US post-Second World War in the fracture of the British colonial empire and the worsening of the situation of these former colonies? didn't the US enforce some economic sanctions in order for the UK to get rid of the colonies? It's a bit complicated. I mean, from the literature we see, like initially the US was not that anti-British colonialism, but it kind of like changed because of the changing dynamics of the Cold War. So it's not like, you know, for or anti-Britain per se, but this leads to a kind of like a different question, which I wanted to ask. We see this instinct in American foreign policy now, asking the Europeans to take more charge of security. So it's kind of like a reverse of, you know, this anti-colonial movement of the 50s and 60s, for example, when US was actively trying, for example, to, you know, go against Britain in the Suez Canal, or France in Vietnam and take over their colonies. So it's kind of like a reverse. Is that political? Is that ideological? Does that have, you know, how much is studying the late imperial officers, how will that help in understanding the changing scenario, for example, in current context?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point. So the late imperial people, and this is true. You know, so who are we talking about? Obviously, the British. You know, this is the biggest empire, the most important empire. The French, to a lesser extent, of course. The Americans have quite a bit of interaction with their French counterparts in Indochina before essentially inheriting an imperial war in Indochina. The Belgians, although, you know, Belgium by that point is really just the Congo until it's let go, but in terms of the size of the Belgian Empire, but the Belgians are intellectually very important in outlining the arguments for continuation of colonial rule. And there's a whole sort of thing in my book about, you know, the Belgian thesis and what was the Belgian thesis. And it's a kind of counterintuitive one. You know, they say, well, of course, you know, colonial rule is alien, but, you know, it's just like the state is alien generally. The state's even alien in Belgium, you know. So, I mean, we're just a temporary arrangement as well. So, so if you want us to send reports on our colonies, we should start sending reports on Belgium itself, because we're basically a colony as well of the Flemish people and the French people. So there's an interesting kind of debate among different powers in the late colonial period. But the general argument is, if you pull back, what are you leaving behind, right? And I think the U.S. role in Suez was, you know, in part just practical. They didn't think that the French and British had the fight to stay in there against Nasser, and the Soviets were going to be Nasser's friend, and the United States needed to practically be seen as not conspiring on the side of an imperialist. But, you know, the more general issue is, what are you leaving behind? What are you leaving behind even in Egypt? If you abandon sort of a sense of responsibility for the people of Egypt. And one of the unintended consequences of that is, as you say, Dr. Maitre, is basically a withdrawal of European security interests around the world, and a shrinking of European military budgets with the imperial decline, and a shift to kind of the welfare state, which had its own negative consequences, and then there's nothing to pick up the pieces in these places. And I do think that, yes, you know, contemporary American advocacy for Europe to share more of the defense burden, you know, needs to be a little bit more historically informed, in the sense that, you know, the United States contributed to the shrinking European budgets because of its advocacy of the withdrawal from empire. And I think it's a contemporary issue that, you know, yes, European cultures need to in some ways re-engage the world, but this is a legacy of decolonization. And this is the problem the United States now faces with its European allies.
So we are kind of reaching to the end of our time, but I definitely want to ask one single question, which is of paramount importance. Given the state of post-colonial research, there is a significant amount of people, or a section of literature, which is not read anymore. You know, I'm not even going to say like that's pro-imperial or anti-colonial or anything of that sort, but there is this entire line of people whose voices are not heard, you know, who are spread out. So that's a disservice to history, to the study of history. So what should be done? This is probably a bit more niche question from an academic to an academic, like what kind of research designs should be done to study more of those, voices, to kind of like put those voices in front, put the primary sources and say, hey, these are the people who were also part of this system, and pretty much like half of the system, and their voices are not heard anymore. So this is what we should do. You as a historian, and this is a very important book, so I want you to, what do you think should be done in that regard?
Yeah, so I want to say that I think history, the discipline of history now, is so rotten to the core that it's not salvageable. Honestly, I believe that. And you talk about primary documents. Primary documents don't do us anything. Primary documents don't select themselves, and they don't interpret themselves. So in the hands of biased and ideologically motivated scholars, primary documents will say exactly what they want them to say. We know that, right? And here's an example I'm going to give. Caroline Elkins has a 900-page book coming out in April called Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire. I mean, do we need to know anything else? Do you want to read that 900 pages? Because guess what? Caroline Elkins, who is of course known for supporting the Mau Mau terrorists in Kenya, has gone around and essentially replicated her research design for all of the British Empire. And guess what? She's gone around and looked for instances of violence. And guess what she found? Instances of violence. And has written an entire history of the British Empire, boiling it down to nothing more than illegitimate violence. Illegitimate violence, right? Which she states pretty clearly at the outset. She believes all states' violence is illegitimate violence. So I'm not sure exactly what she has in mind. So here's my takeaway from looking at the Elkins book, which I will review, is I don't think historians are capable of writing history anymore. Why? Because they don't get trained in social science. They don't get trained in questions of counterfactuals, feasible alternatives, controls, basically other factors that might explain outcomes, how to make up one's mind, how to test the relative importance of different factors or theories, or even just to think through it. I'm not talking econometrics. I'm just talking logic. I'm talking the logic of social inquiry, which is, how do you measure something? How do you define it? How do you choose data? How do you set up a logical test or a logical way of thinking through the relative importance of different factors? How do you explain outcomes by thinking about different factors? How do you think about counterfactuals? I mean, all of this stuff is just the logic of social inquiry, and historians have lost an ability to engage in logical social inquiry now. Why? Because they spend all their time doing race, class, and gender studies, right? And they're basically taught to be ideologues, not to be scientists. And so, you say, well, how can we get back to more primary? I have no faith in primary documents. Caroline Elkins spends her whole life with primary documents and comes up with a complete monstrous distortion of the British Empire coming out in April, 900 pages. So what I think we need to do is get back to a logic of social inquiry, teach people to think logically and scientifically about the historical past. And that's no small order, because there's a lot of other things competing for their time right now as graduate students, like diversity seminars and post-colonial theorists and someone studying Foucault. And that's the stuff that's filling up their time, and we're losing basically good social scientists.
But I look forward to meeting you in person, and thank you for the book, and I hope we all enjoyed this webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to the National Association of Scholars for setting this up, and thanks to you, Dr. Matra, for hosting this and writing kindly of it, and thanks for the readers for
It's always a pleasure.
Being dissidents, because I do think that this is one of the I think treats of walking outside of the orthodoxy on colonial issues is you're engaged in an active dissent. And I think that's a great intellectual project, is to be engaged in dissent.
That's right. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to everyone.